I received a phone call from the chief scientist, Dr. Williams, at BP, asking if I would consider being in charge of a program to do basic research on the spill and how it could be dealt with. I agreed that it would be interesting to do this, but I said, look, it really has to be independent, fully independent. And there was no question. Dr. Williams said, of course, it would be independent. My requirement was that it had to be modeled entirely like the National Science Foundation with respect to requests for proposals, proposal submission, reviews, panels, etc., so that a fair, honest evaluation of proposals would be made, and that this would be an opportunity to carry out basic research applied to a very important national problem, namely dealing with the aspects of oil spills that were really critical to the nation. What happens to the ecology? What happens to the people who are working and living in the shore areas? And especially, what happens to those who are the fishermen whose lives and livelihood depend on having fish, shellfish available for market and for the public as a food source? So these were the kinds of questions that we wanted the curious mind of investigators to address and provide the best information that could be made available for the public. So I agreed to form the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative Research Board. We had seasoned experts who knew about the Gulf and served on the board and knew their colleagues who were really outstanding scientists. All of this together provided us with an opportunity to build an extraordinary program. Well, it doesn't feel like 10 years have gone by. It's amazing. But here we are at the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative Symposium. It's a day that we've put together to synthesize or to bring together all that we've learned and to celebrate a decade of research in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'd like to welcome all of you to today and thank you for being with us. You're really part of the GoMRI family. We do have a GoMRI research community and key organizations, and they're represented here. But I'd like to share an anecdote. David Hollander, he's one of the scientists. He went to a New York wedding, but they held it in LA. Figured that one out. But anyway, there amongst the guests was Matt Damon. And so David goes over and says to Matt Damon, I'm honored to meet you. It's a delight to be here. And he said, Matt Damon said, I know you. And he recognized him from dispatches from the Gulf. So Matt Damon said to David that this was a great thing to do to communicate to the public, and it was great science. So there you have it, all the way from Hollywood, a recognition of the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. Well, I'm delighted to introduce Ellen Williams. I've known Ellen for a long time, and as you saw in the film clip, the conversation with her is what started this whole thing. I'm honored to have you with me here today, and I'd just like to say that Ellen is a colleague at the University of Maryland, a distinguished university professor. She does research on surface chemistry, nanotechnology. She earned her bachelor's degree from Michigan State and her PhD from Caltech. She's a member of the National Academy. And she's founded the University of Maryland Materials Research Center, and she's the director. A period of time she was at DOE, and then is now back at the University of Maryland. So welcome. Comments?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Rita. It's such an honor to be invited to come back. I feel like it's the bookend. I can't believe it was 10 years ago that this all started, and I'm just delighted to be here to see what's been accomplished, and I'm really looking forward to the events of the day.
So you've been here from the very beginning. So you called me. What are your memories? What were your hopes for creating the program?
Boy, the memories are pretty intense. That was a very stressful time. I was at Princeton. BP sponsors the Princeton Carbon Mitigation Institute. I was there for a meeting. I got an emergency phone call to come to DC to talk about, with groups of people, about the potential of BP starting or setting up a research initiative in the Gulf. And then I was shuttled off to Houston, where I met some of the people on the response team, and in particular, Bob Dudley, who later became the CEO of BP, personally tasked me to help set up something along their vision for putting forward $50 million a year for 10 years to support research on the environmental impacts of the oil spill. And that was challenging. It was not surprising to me that BP wanted to do this. I deeply remember the first day after the oil spill. I was working in London at BP headquarters, and I'd been there for 3 months. I was getting to know the people. I walked in that morning. I hadn't seen the news, and the place was like a morgue. Everybody was in shock. You know, people had died. This horrible environmental problem was arising, and it just got worse and worse day after day as the magnitude of the problem became clear. So people were actively involved in the response and trying to shut down the well. Other people were told to keep doing your job. It was very intensely frustrating to feel so helpless that all these bad things were going on. So it wasn't a surprise to me that BP wanted to start a research initiative. BP had a long history of working with universities. I mentioned the Princeton Carbon Mitigation Institute. They also had a big research program going with Berkeley and the University of Illinois on biosciences for production of biofuels. So they were familiar with the idea of working with university research, and this was a natural extension. So Bob asked me to look into thinking about how we would set such a thing up, and one of the first things that occurred to me was there couldn't possibly be a better person to guide and direct such an institute than the former director of NSF, my longtime friend, Rita.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, my first reaction when I got the call was, yeah, I think I could do this, mainly because I had been doing oil degradation studies for a long time, and I had a PhD student, John Walker, who was extraordinarily productive. We published about 40 papers on oil degradation, and then Jody Deming, another student, had been studying hydrostatic pressure, and we'd built a sampler because this was in the deep sea.
Yeah.
It wasn't near shore. And putting all this together, plus one of my students had actually done a PhD thesis on the natural seeps that occur in the Gulf of Mexico. So it had all come together. But what did BP really expect?
So I think that BP wanted, honest science. They wanted people speaking with an honest, unbiased voice about these issues, and they were willing to accept that the results would come out as they would come out, but that they would be results that BP could see were honest and unbiased. My perception on this coming out of academia, in fact, I was funded by NSF for most of my research career, was that I wanted to have a setup that was founded with great scientific integrity, that allocated resources by peer review, that was accountable, and that the outcomes were published in the open literature and all the results were made public. And so that was my vision, completely supported by BP going in, and as I said before, I couldn't think of a better model than the way NSF does things to get started.
Well, my reaction was, of course, that yes, running it the way NSF does things, but I was really concerned, as you heard from the video, about independence. So my first question was, will this be independent, totally free?
Yeah. And my response was absolutely. I mean, the political situation and my own leanings were that was absolutely the way it had to be. And I did not get any pushback from within BP on that. The idea was that this was going to be a free and independent institution. Yeah.
And what parts of the original vision could not be compromised? I mean, there was no way that we could do anything differently than what you had hoped.
Yeah, I think the really strong sticking point was that the the Institute had to be free of political pressures and of BP pressures as well. And that was an absolute, requirement from my point of view. And it was one that BP really supported. As you know, as we got started on this process, the original vision was that we would just have an open competition. We wanted to have the best scientists from all over the world. And over the summer, we heard increasingly from the Gulf states concerns that they had the best expertise, they knew the Gulf, they really needed to be engaged closely. And so that negotiation of how we would make sure that we really drew on the best local knowledge from the Gulf states was one that could easily have gotten embroiled in politics. And Bob Dudley, other folks from BP, worked very closely with the Gulf states and set up the organizational structure that you have now, where 10 of the board members were selected by BP, 10 of the board members were appointed by the states, and it has been, amazingly successful. One of the great successes, I think, of the Gulf of Mexico Research Institute is that those two groups of 10 people did not polarize, did not set up an adversarial relationship, but instead came together to really drive the best science that could be developed out of the funding that was supplied.
Well, there were some hurdles. The master research agreement had to be drafted, and that really focused on what the research would be, what research would be done. As it turned out, it was totally appropriate. And how did that get drafted? Do you know?
Yeah, the master research agreement, of course, would start at the scientific side. I was in group technology, and so on the science side, we had many good environmental people in the company, and it was fairly straightforward to lay out the key issues that had to be addressed: oil degradation, effects on wetlands, and so forth. But of course, it also had to go and be approved within BP by lawyers and finance people, et cetera, and it also had to be approved by the Gulf states. And so there was tremendous amount of circling and going around and getting the master research agreement put in place. And I was so happy that Rita was on board at that time to use her wisdom and experience to find the points in the agreement where there might be sticking points and make sure we got those ironed out.
Well, I think your comment about the board is absolutely on point. It operates almost as a family. I mean, we really interact very, very well. And we really did adhere very rigidly to the National Science Foundation operation, but we also included the National Academy of Sciences, how to be a scientist, so the ethics and the approach taken. This turned out to be very effective because, frankly, everybody's familiar with how the NSF operates, and if a question came up or a complaint, our response was, as a board, would you have complained to NSF? And that sort of cut things off right there.
Yeah.
Now, the data that we've been gathering, BP had explicitly insisted that, rightfully, that all the data be stored. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so that was a very strong push from within BP, from some of the scientists there, recognizing that the type of environmental data and the breadth of topics that were being covered, there was historically, coming out of the oil industry and other organizations, information on these topics, but it was scattered and it was in places that were hard to find. Often it was not digitized. And so a recognition that in making this investment of a very substantial amount of money, that information should be available for the future, because there almost certainly were going to be, and there have been, oil spills since then, and we need to learn from the past, and we can only learn from the past if we have that data available, readily available. And I have to say that I find it truly impressive when I look at what the GoMRI has done in terms of setting up that incredibly complex database and making it openly available. I think that's one of your huge successes.
GridC deserves a lot of credit.
Yeah.
Members of the board who worked with GridC, Peter Brewer comes to mind, really worked hard to make sure that it was usable, not just there and stored, but you could actually accession it And I understand some publications have already started coming out, just going to the data and using them. So that's been rewarding. Now, you mentioned the political atmosphere around the time. That was kind of rocky because initially there was a sense that simply turning it over to the Gulf states. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the political situation really evolved pretty dramatically. At the beginning, there was a sense that BP and the U.S. government were going to work together and get this solved, and really deal with the event itself. And for the working people, I think that relationship continued, but the political situation evolved to become much more fraught and confrontational as partisan politics came into play and public outrage over the impacts of the oil spill grew. So there was a very unpleasant, almost violent atmosphere at times in terms of people's perceptions of what was going on and how people reacted. It was very stressful because a lot of uncertainty. We just didn't know a lot of things about what were happening. So as we talked with the representatives of the Gulf states, it took a lot of effort to present to them the fact that indeed the intentions were good, that we did want to work with them, that this was not a nefarious activity of trying to bring in outsiders or anything like that. So there was a huge amount of interpersonal effort that had to go into just lowering people's suspicions so that they could accept that this was, the intention here was this was going to be a well-run institute, independent and really delivering the best science. It took time.
The other point that we, as a board, felt very strongly about was that we had to reach out to the public and make sure they understood what was going on, but it was also very important to describe how you do science, so that they would understand the expectations of what the scientists were attempting to do. And we engaged the team that produced the dispatches from the Gulf, and because I had served as a Sea Grant director, I knew the Sea Grant program, and we brought them in because we wanted to make sure that we would get to right to the working folks, the fishermen and the folks. How did that fit in with the plan for BP?
Well, certainly from BP's point of view, one of the aspects of the response was that people had been denied their livelihoods. The oil spill cut back on fishing, it cut back on tourism, and so BP was actively involved in using the response itself, hiring people and getting people engaged and employed in response. So all of these activities to reach out to local communities, find out what their needs were, and help to meet them tied in really well with these activities.
And we've also spent a lot of time and effort on education and producing graduate students with excellent theses, but reaching out to the school kids as well. So it's left a legacy, really, for you and for BP. Is there anything else left undone?
I know there are things that are left undone. One thing that was in the back of my mind when we started the Research Institute was the thought that it would be amazing and wonderful if we could find better ways to ameliorate the effects of oil on the environment, better ways to degrade it, restore wetlands, et cetera. And I think that that's an area where there continues to be a huge effort that's needed. Of course, the best thing is not to have oil spills, but human activity is what it is.
Well, I've been asked what would I have done differently by colleagues in the field, and I don't think what we created would be really improved. It worked so well. However, one part of the work that I think if I had realized in the beginning that there was not really a discipline of health and the environment, and that in effect we were involved in helping create it. And so the public health aspect, we tried so hard to get funding and get programs going. And I think knowing now, I think we probably should have made a greater effort to help establish what I think is really very important. So I just wondered if you have any comments, this whole area of public health that's directed to environment interaction, the kinds of effects that just having the environment stable and safe for public health.
Yeah, I think that's a huge and growing area as we look at social justice and public health impacts. The fact that populations might be living in areas that have greater pollution, greater environmental degradation, that creates a baseline for their health that is not positive. And as we increasingly have big data science activities and ways of pulling together information, I think there is a tremendous amount of potential there. Having that baseline information so that you can understand the changes that take place when a disaster happens is really important.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Do you have any other comments?
As I said, it's such a pleasure, it's such an honor to be here. I am truly looking forward to hearing the synthesis and overviews of what happened today and a little bit of the presentations tomorrow. Thank you so much, Rita.
Thank you
for all you've done. Yeah.